Yep. Me too. And I didn't get that hard, but like I really want to find Asa. Every so often, like half-hearted ass a film person. When I find prints of like 1920 films, and they say, "Well, you're gonna look here and there." Those places don't No, so there's a particular film, like a film that made in 1920. None of the obvious are popular. Maybe, and I can believe that. If it's sitting someplace that doesn't know about it, anyone knows. And again, like, I haven't actually learned yet, but it's very hard. My dissertation was called City Walks, and then they made me change it. Why they made it? It's like, oh, well, that's just a title. It's just a You really did look like well, in like, if you write, you have like your right does have that.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the second session of our Gallatin Climate Change Initiative Conference. My name is Matt Stanley. I'm a professor here at the Gallatin School. I'll be chairing this session. This is the session on climate and the imagination, which roughly speaking is humanistic perspectives on issues of climate change. Our first speaker will be Carl Apoon from the History Department here at NYU. He'll be speaking on the pitfalls of climate history, a note of caution on the prime mover problem.
Am I doing it from the podium?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right, I've got my stopwatch here, and go. Okay, so great to see so many people. My talk has actually changed somewhat because of events of the last 30 days, so I'll hopefully end on a slightly more optimistic note, oddly enough, but we'll see. I'm going to make an argument today that's really a little bit abstract. It's about the way in which historians mobilize climate as an explanatory tool, or actually really how historians mismobilize, in a certain sense, climate as an explanatory tool. I am an environmental historian, but I don't work on the recent past. I work on early modern Italy, and let's say roughly kind of most of my work falls in the period between 1450 and about 1750, and I'm actually going to come back to that those dates right at the end. What I actually want to start with, though, is I want to talk about something completely different. In 1986, the environmental historian Alfred Crosby published a landmark and also widely criticized book called Ecological Imperialism. You're probably all familiar with it, not because necessarily you've run into Al Crosby, but because you have at least seen the lightly edited version of the book that came out under the pen name Jared Diamond in 1999, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And in this book, Crosby makes this argument about the biological dimensions of a historical fact, which is that people of European descent live in majority situations in countries all over the globe, something he calls, and people are sometimes uncomfortable with this term, but it's all right, he calls them Neo-Europes. And Crosby says the explanation for this has nothing to do with European culture, it has nothing to do with European propensity to make war or expand, or with capitalism or European economic organization. it really has to do with environments. It has to do with ecological niches. It has to do with something that he calls portmanteau biota. Diamond used the term cargo because you don't want to be too similar. And Crosby's argument, sort of in a 20-second version, is that Europeans in certain places, in certain climatic conditions, temperate climatic conditions, enjoyed ecological advantages. They had smallpox, they had certain set of crops, they had a certain set of domesticated animals that they came in, that these things were the sort of shock troops that then prepared these places for ultimately settler colonialism. Now, this is a book that gets widely trashed in a lot of different contexts, and often rightly so, in part because it comes off in the end as a kind of apologia for the sins of settler colonialism. But for me, the book is still interesting, not for what it does well, but for what it does badly. And what it does badly, in a certain sense, is it turns one thing, and it's this ecological compatibility argument, into a prime mover. That this then explains everything, and human beings have nothing to do with it, or at least they're sort of the passive collectors of the actions of other biota. Now, why start with this? Because of the urgency of the anthropogenic climate change problem, climate history has become, in the last 10 years, a version of Crosby's ecological imperialism argument. The book that I would throw out as the kind of best or worst example, depending on how you want to think of it, is the really eminent historian Jeffrey Parker's Global Crisis book, which again uses a climate event in my period, he's in my period, called the Little Ice Age, when there was a global cooling fluctuation, to explain a whole bunch of different events that happened all around the world in the period from about 1500 to about 1700 or 1750, should sound familiar, or what used to be called the general crisis of the 17th century, the long 17th century in this case. And so Parker says everything from the fall of the Mughal Empire in India, the fall of the Ming Dynasty in China, the 30 Years' War in Europe, and so on, the fall of the Aztecs and the Maya can be explained not by portmanteau biota or cargo, but because of this cooling trend that occurred. And again, you have the same problem. First of all, climatologists don't even agree on when this cooling trend happened. They agree that it reaches sort of peak in the year 1650 approximately, but when it starts and when it ends, we're not sure. What its real effects locally are, we're not sure. It's a little bit like smallpox for Crosby. It becomes the thing that explains everything. And what this does, I think, for historians who are really bad predictors of the future, I want to start to admit that, is that it deploys an argument that's easily defeatable, you can say. This doesn't explain everything. What about human agency? What about culture? What about technology? And so on and so forth. It's a weak argument. It sounds great. It fits with the concerns of the present moment, but it's inherently weak. And the people on the other side are good at exploiting these weaknesses. And they're good at pointing and saying, hey, Parker, important professor, jackass, that's not how things really work. And this is the same thing that they say to people who say, oh my God, climate change is causing X or Y phenomena. So as an environmental historian, I'm going to end on an optimistic note here rather than continue with my small Jeremiad. And I'm going to take us back to North China in the year 1048, when something really dramatic happened. This is from a recent book by historian Ling Zhang. It's a really terrific book. She's really an incredible historian up at BC, excuse me. Anyway, on the 6th day of the 6th lunar month in the 8th year of the reign of Emperor Renzong, China's second largest river, the Yellow River, breached its northern bank at a site called Shanghu. From this location in modern northern Henan province, the The river tore apart over 700 meters of its banks. Its torrents burst through the rupture and surged northward into the Hebei Plain. Over the next few days, the river gouged the earth open, created a channel for a new northern flow, made its tortuous way nearly 700 kilometers towards the vicinity of present-day Xinjiang. What she's telling you about is how the Yellow River went in a period of about 3 months from a river with a single outlet to the massive delta system that we know about it today. And she explains that this is not a natural catastrophe. It's because of 500 or 600 years of human action on the plain, of damming, of diverting, and so on, that created the conditions for this catastrophic event. That's the kind of argument that integrates the action of the natural world with human agency or human action and gives a full explanation. And I'm optimistic, I know I'm 1 second over, because the coverage of Harvey stressed not only the heroism of rescuers and so on, but stressed the fact that Houston flooded in particular ways because it was built in particular ways. And that's an argument that environmental historians have been making for 20 years, but finally it's trickled its way into the media. So I'll end on a note of cautious optimism. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Carl. Next up, we have Bella Mirabella speaking on Reading the Signs, What Shakespeare Can Teach Us About Climate Change.
Do we have images and everything here? There's nothing here.
They're coming.
Oh,
This gentleman. Sneaking up on you.
what does it say? I'll say more.
Yeah, cool.
Sorry about those
Okay,
20
wonderful.
seconds.
Okay, thank you all. I wanted to bring Shakespeare into this issue. Why wouldn't we want to bring Shakespeare into every issue? So obviously, so I'm saying Reading the Signs, What Shakespeare Can Teach Us About Climate Change. Obviously, I'm looking at this from a literary, interpretive position. And so I want to be thinking about that many of us here obviously are concerned about the effects of environmental issues and climate change. And we might think that some of the calamities of our environment around depletion and pollution, for example, started with the Industrial Revolution. But if we look back to the period that I study, similar to Carl's period, which is the early modern period, we'll find that there were many problems around the misuse of natural resources and disregard for nature, as well as concern over environmental issues. And in fact, Carl's, one of his, among many fine works he's done is his recent work on Venice and their problems with forestation and managing their wood. His book is called Forest on the Sea. So the problems of the consumption, of the overconsumption of wood and deforestation, for example, in the early modern period, in large part due to shipbuilding as well as fuels, existed. Oh, I thought I would get the next one. There's forest. Here's a woodcut showing deforestation. You can see them cutting down trees and also the absence of trees in that picture. So this problem of deforestation existed throughout Europe from medieval times, and in fact England was apparently deforested in the 12th century. And some of us are familiar perhaps with the story that Shakespeare's Globe Theatre was actually built by dismantling another theater in the very cold early morning of December of 1598. The theater called, the actual theater that they dismantled was called The Theater, and it was dismantled and they took it in boats across the Thames and went to the other side and reconstructed the Globe. And that is indeed true, and it was in part over a conflict over ownership, but it was also, many scholars such as Vin Nardizzi feel that it was reconstructed in this way of stealing lumber because the price of lumber had gone up so remarkably high that people could not afford it. So in Shakespeare's time, one solution to the overconsumption of wood was to use something called sea coal, which was mined along the coast and brought into London on ships. And Mistress Quickly in Merry Wives of Windsor, in fact, refers to her very warm sea coal fire. But the problem with using sea coal is that as a fossil fuel, it had a very high sulfur content, and as such, caused tremendous air pollution and soot and acid rain, which damaged and killed gardens and farms. Queen Elizabeth apparently was really grieved and annoyed with the taste and smoke of sea coals, and another contemporary complained about the loathsome airs of smoky city London. So we think that London had all that trouble in the Industrial Revolution, but obviously it happened before. The thing I'm particularly interested in, though, today that I really want to talk about with focus on Shakespeare is the idea of connectivity and linkage between Shakespeare and between nature and human beings. And I want to use nature in a very broad way to include human beings, as opposed to seeing human beings as separate from animals and plants and all of that. And you see throughout Shakespeare, those of you who are familiar with his works, a tremendous emphasis and use of images from the natural world. Just a very quick example, that's one of my favorites, is a description of England by John of Gaunt in Richard II, when he refers to England as a demi-paradise, a fortress built by nature for herself, a precious stone set in the silver sea. This linkage that I'm interested in exploring is a well-known fact about the idea of the great chain of being, this idea that every element of creation, from the heavens and the gods all the way down to the smallest creature, is linked together in a kind of a harmony and a hierarchy. But the interesting thing about these links is that one link nourishes the other, and so that we all need each other in order to survive. This concept, maybe for my purposes, couldn't be very beautifully seen and thought about with a play like Midsummer Night's Dream, which is set by and large in a forest. As such, the comedy is saturated by references to nature, its beauty and power, from Oberon's description of Titania's bank, which is where wild thyme and oslips and nodding violet grows, which is o'er-canopied with luscious woodbine and roses, to his reference of his magic flower of milk white that becomes purple with love's wound, and to the mechanical green plot as a stage for their play and a hawthorn brake for their dressing room. But given the many references to and uses of natural imagery throughout, it is not surprising that Titania, invoking in fact the idea of the great chain of being, should chide Oberon for quarreling, because she says his brawls have really disturbed their circle dances, which is interesting because brawl is also the name of the circle dance. But it is not only the actions of the king and the queen and the fact that it's interfered with their personal pleasures that has disturbed her. It is that the disruption in the chain has had catastrophic consequences. There are contagious fogs sucked up from the sea, rheumatic diseases, the rivers are overriding their boundaries, the corn is rotting in the field, the animals are dying. But perhaps the greatest catastrophe is that, as she says, the seasons alter. And those are her words, that flowers are growing when there should be frost, and frost is coming out when the flowers are growing. And the most important thing, she says, is that this progeny of evils comes from Oberon's and her dissension. We are their parents and originals, she says. So what I really want to emphasize here, and I may not be able to say all I wanted to say, is that Shakespeare and his contemporaries understood that humans needed to take immediate notice of the calamities in nature. We need to read the signs. We need to realize that we are the cause of the calamity, as Titania says, and that nature, and that when there's discord in nature, it means that there is discord throughout the chain. Floods, for example, in Shakespeare, were interpreted as anarchy and insubordination. I wanted to end with King Lear, and there's two very quick things I'll only mention, and then I'll conclude, that there's a debate in this play. Really, I think it's a debate between Edmund and Gloucester. Gloucester sees all the terrible things happening around him, and he says to his son Edmund, he says, "These late eclipses in the sun and moon portend no good." He sees treasons in the palace, love cooling, friendship falling off, and the bond cracked twixt son and father. Edmund dismisses his father's ideas as the excellent, Forgot it. Excellent foppery of the world, thank you. And, but I just want to say, Edmund ends up dead and disgraced, and Gloucester proves to be absolutely right, that the storm in many ways does in fact mirror the follies and the misjudgments of the people. And I just have this at the end to show that there's a great moment in the storm in which not only does the storm mirror perhaps Lear's internal distress, but also it's in the storm that he has a great understanding of that he has not been a good ruler, that he has not taken care of his people, and that he has to be more attentive to that. So I'm just going to end with one sentence which says that let's try to learn from Shakespeare in this time of climate change, to read the signs and to use the past to help us find solutions for the problems of the present. Thank you.
Next up, we have Professor Sarah Murphy, going to tell us about fog, smog, and putrid fermentation, Dickens's environments. We try to keep you on your feet.
I know, you got me on my toes. Okay, so. The blue one goes forward? Yep. Okay, and it's going to show up here magically. So as the title here suggests, I want to talk to you a little bit today about visibility, invisibility, and bad smells. And I'm going to say in advance, though, I have to bracket because of a very short period of time, so the bad smells, we may just graze by those, and that may gratify some of you. But we're just going to kind of whiz by that. I don't have a lot to say about bad smells. But I do have, oh, everything went crazy here. How do I go back? What happened? Whoops-a-daisy. There we go. This is too. I'm a short person. So it would clearly be rather anachronistic for me to say to you that Charles Dickens wrote about climate change in our sense. After all, Dickens is writing in the middle years of the 19th century. But of course, those middle years of the 19th century are part and parcel of the period 1750, 1850, 1860, that we often associate with the term Industrial Revolution. And that is to say that this period has a peculiar claim on the study of how science acts within the social world, as one scholar recently noted, because it coordinates the wide-scale techno-scientific revolution that made industrialization possible with our earliest attempts to find social forms adequate to address and respond to that transformation. So however hastily, I want you to think about two central things today. What kinds of social, and in this case literary forms, are adequate to address the transformations of our environment, that is, our environment has undergone over the last 250 plus years? And how pre-20th century writers, who are not writing sci-fi or speculative works, might help us to frame that question. That is to say, how do creative writers, at a moment when industrialization's impacts are first being felt in a broad and pervasive way, participate in finding social forms to address these transformations? The quintessential writer of the Victorian city, Dickens depicts the interdependence of humans and an environment largely created by humans in this way, and his work lets us ask some important questions about literary form, history, and the transformations that industrialization is making to those relationships. As you can see here, the Victorian era saw the effects of I'm going to give you a little bit very quick historical background. The Victorian era saw the effects of rapid industrialization and urbanization. In fact, early effects of the era scientists and scholars have come now to call, however disputedly, the Anthropocene. Watt's steam engine, invented in the late 18th century, enabled not only extraction of coal, but its transport via railroad. Well, actually, let me go back. But the coming of the railroad collapsed space and time, the Victorians would say, enabling the mobility of persons and things and contributing to increasing urban populations. Urban infrastructures found themselves under great pressure. Let me see if I go back. Sorry. So urban infrastructures found themselves under great pressure from rapidly increasing populations, and these populations, including not only differences in air quality, and Bella just mentioned that the quality of the air as a result of the burning of coal had been mentioned for quite a long time, but that that bad quality intensifies in the 19th century, and as well as the putrid state of the Thames River. There's my putrid fermentation. Putrid state of the Thames River, which became by the late 1850s a flowing parade of raw sewage and industrial effluent. All these are registered in various ways by the writers of fiction and nonfiction, by parliamentary committees, by pundits and activist groups. So while we think of factories as a source of pollution in air and water, it was actually smoke from domestic fires for heating and cooking that had perhaps more of an impact on the capital than industrial pollution, and London not being predominantly an industrial city. So this kind of connects. The reason I threw this in here is, or I draw your attention to it, is that it really connects with questions about regulating private consumption. The one thing that could not be regulated as the century goes on, the one thing that there was an enormous amount of resistance to regulating was the private consumption of coal. In novel after novel, Dickens depicts urban space constituted through industrial production and consumption. I'm going to look just quickly and closely at a small passage from Bleak House from 1853 today, but I could just as easily have drawn on a number of others of his novels. Hard Times, which is set in a northern industrial city that he calls Coketown, and we could call Manchester, or the Thames River in Our Mutual Friend. So this is my passage, and it's a very famous opening passage, and obviously there's a lot of text here, and I'm not going to get to talk about all of it, but one of the things that we could say, and I'm just going to let you look at that, we can read this passage as it's a setting. It's what we literary scholars conventionally call setting the scene, right? And so we can read it as a reflection of the urban landscape in central London in the middle of the 19th century in a sort of reflective mode, exaggerated, but nonetheless a reflection. But we also might be inclined, if we're good literary scholars, to immediately see metaphor. This is a novel after all. Whoa, okay. This is a novel after all that will focus on government institutions, in particular in the Court of Chancery and hampered vision, reduction of people and things in this long passage gives us a fitting prelude to the effects of government incompetence and bureaucratic indifference. In either case, in other words, what we might see here is the way in which the material effects of carbon production are abstracted, and metaphor is the instrument of that abstraction. Metaphor displaces a set of material conditions and the proximate causes and makes them symbols of government law and the interiorities of individuals. But in either case, we might risk failing to see what this passage is making visible to us. And this is the passage I gave you a minute ago. Nicholas Mirzoff has remarked, the Anthropocene is built into our senses. It determines our perceptions. That is to say, there are things we can't see, we're so accustomed to. But what I wanted to ask is, or what this passage makes me ask, what these moments in 19th century fiction make me ask, is that maybe we forget for instance here, Dickens' positioning. We might engage in our own double game of suppressing, of rendering the framing of our perceptions invisible. It's unclear, in other words, that the smog is so aesthetically invisible to Dickens or to his readers. In fact, people are talking a great deal in different ways through the mid and late 19th century about how the smoke from the burning of what was usually called sea coal, we could read this moment then as one where what is determinative of our perceptions has not yet become determinative of the Victorians, or is only in the process of so becoming. So there might be a couple of quick things I would want to draw your attention to here, and I'm going to do it much more hastily than I normally would. But we have a lot going on in this passage. We have evocations of multiple scales of time. And we have a professional calendar, we have deep time, we have, and we have the normal calendrical November. We have evocations of all kinds of scientific, popularized scientific ideas, some of which valid, some of which not. There's a lot going on here, but the one thing I'm just going to wrap up is that we could say that here human agency and natural agency become blended in this passage. The place of the human is separable from or is acting upon nature becomes very complicated. Literature, and just as a final thing, literature is not just representing a world that we could easily learn about. We could just as easily learn about from the historical documents. And it isn't just offering us figurative language, the vehicle of which we can ignore. We should look at literary works as understanding it as something else is going on. Literary works let us think about the ways in which larger historical transformations are given social form. And I'll just wrap up there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Next up, we have Professor Ann DeWitt, who will be speaking about climate change and science fiction imagination.
And this should just show up if
Magically helpful.
okay. All right. My starting point today is one of the readings. Mike? How's that? Better? Okay. So my starting point today is one of the readings from this year's convocation. So it's Amitav Ghosh's argument in his 2016 book about climate change, which is titled The Great Derangement. Ghosh argues that climate change is enabled by a failure of the cultural imagination, and he breaks this failure down into two main beliefs. The first is the belief that nature is regular, moderate, slow, and gradual, so as a result of this, there's this idea that it's ignorant to believe in catastrophic change. The second is the belief that consciousness and agency are the property of humans, not of animals or inanimate forces like the weather. So for Ghosh, he sort of puts this in terms of the belief that humans look out at a world that doesn't look back at us. Ghosh is a novelist, so he's interested in how these failures shape fiction, specifically the realist novel. And Ghosh argues that realist fiction shuns catastrophe and focuses on humans, not animals or spirits or gods. Ghosh sees the success of the realist novel and the prestige it has gained as both symptom and cause of the failures of imagination that are behind climate change. Now, Ghosh does recognize that some narrative forms don't follow these realist conventions, and these include science fiction. But he concludes that science fiction cannot correct our failures of imagination because it is set in another world. It's divided from our lived reality because it takes place in the future or on another planet or in another of what Terry Pratchett calls the trouser legs of time. I think this gives short shrift to science fiction, and I'm going to argue today briefly that some science fiction avoids these failures of imagination Ghosh describes, but it also retains a recognizable connection to the present. I'm going to make this case with two novels. The first is Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, which was published in 1993. Parable begins in a suburb of Los Angeles in 2024, in a world that has seen a slow-moving, multi-part apocalypse, which is comprised of a series of economic disasters, international conflicts, a warming world, and a severe perpetual California drought. In some ways, the setting of Parable of the Sower seems indeed like another world. Mars is being colonized, the freeways of LA are full of migrants rather than cars, and the characters include hyper-empaths who experience physically the bodily pain of other people. However, as historian Mike Davis has argued, these elements constitute, as he calls it, an extrapolation of the plight of LA communities devastated by the urban policies of the 1980s. Moreover, Butler captures a set of issues that have hardly gone away: wealth disparity, the erosion of public goods and services, schools, transportation, etc., in favor of privatization, the suspension of environmental regulations, worker protection, and human rights in the name of economic prosperity. And it's hard to consider Butler's SF as otherworldly after a summer that saw the US's departure from the Paris Agreement in the name of American jobs, efforts to take healthcare away from 22 million people in order to supply $50,000 a year in tax cuts to those with seven-figure incomes, and Hurricane Harvey's devastation of Houston, which, as Carl was speaking out about a moment ago was the tragic result not only of warming oceans, but also the city's decision to sacrifice responsible planning to pressure from developers. The crises of Butler's novels awaken us to the catastrophic quality of what is taking place right now. All right, I want to turn to my second example and Ghosh's second argument, his critique of the view that consciousness and agency are limited to humans. Ghosh acknowledges that this view is hardly ubiquitous even within Western narratives, and he gives examples from genre fiction and film, werewolves, vampires, zombies, and the asteroid-dwelling beast into which the Millennium Falcon inadvertently flies in The Empire Strikes Back. So these are all examples of non-human agency and consciousness, but they are limited to otherworldly beings. However, I don't think this is all that SF does with the non-human. And as an example, I want to look at Ursula Le Guin's novel, The Dispossessed, which was published in 1974. The Dispossessed is subtitled An Ambiguous Utopia, and it concerns two planets, Urus and its moon Anaris. And Anaris has been settled by anarchists estranged from Urus. Anaris is a desert without land animals, which contributes to the ambiguity of its utopian status. So when Shevek, who's an Anarestrian and the novel's protagonist, when he travels to Urus, his first encounter with an animal startles him. There looked at him from the darkness under the roadside foliage for one instant a face. It was not like any human face. It was as long as his arm and ghastly white. Breath jetted in vapor from what must be nostrils, and terrible, unmistakable, there was an eye. A large dark eye, mournful, perhaps cynical. So Shevek's reaction is like the attitude that Ghosh diagnoses as problematic, to see the non-human look back at us with consciousness, with this expression that has to be deciphered, is unexpected, disconcerting, and indeed terrible. And yet this isn't all for Shevek, who also thinks of his partner, Takver. He wondered what that deep, dry, dark gaze out of the darkness would have meant, to Takver. She had always known that all lives are in common. Takver would have known how to look back at that eye in the darkness under the trees. Takver, that is, knows that the non-human possesses consciousness and agency, and the thought of her shapes Shevek's attitude in his second encounter with an animal. The otter sat up on its haunches and looked at him. Its eyes were dark, shot with gold, intelligent, curious, innocent. Amr, Shevek whispered, caught by that gaze across the gulf of being. Brother. So these are moments of recognizing the connection of human and non-human that are not otherworldly, that could indeed take place in a realist novel. And in The Dispossessed, this recognition of connection between human and non-human is akin to the recognition of connection between human and human that is at the heart of the novel's utopianism. So Ghosh thinks that science fiction can't really address climate change because it's set elsewhere, not in the world of the present. But Parable and The Dispossessed join a lot of science fiction in toggling between the otherworldly and the familiar. And this quality was famously described by science fiction scholar Darko Suvin as what he calls cognitive estrangement. And he sees this as kind of central to the genre. So what does this mean for climate change? Well, one pessimistic view is summed up by a sign from the Women's March on January 21st. All right, Octavia warned us. Okay, science fiction has been telling us what to watch out for, but we didn't listen. On the other hand, Shevek offers a more hopeful note at the end of The Dispossessed. And he's speaking, The Dispossessed is set about 100 years in our future. He's speaking to an Earth woman whose planet has become a hot gray world covered with bits of plastic. He says, "You think Anaris is a future that cannot be reached, as your past cannot be changed. We cannot come to you. You will not let us. You do not believe in change, in chance, in evolution. You would rather destroy us than admit our reality, rather than admit that there is hope. We cannot come to you. We can only wait for you to come to us." Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Greg Vargo from the Gallatin School and the Department of English. He'll be telling us about Looking Katrina in the Eye, teaching Jesmyn Ward's Salvage the Bones in a contemporary environmental fiction course.
Yeah. No. Okay.
All right, thanks to the organizers of this conference. Really glad to be participating, and especially Anne for the invitation to join this panel. So I'm going to discuss a constellation of texts that I teach in a Gallatin class called The Literature of Environmental Crisis, and it looks at many of the things, the themes of this panel. I'm going to think specifically about Jesmyn Ward's novel, Salvage the Bones, which recounts the impact of Hurricane Katrina on an African-American family living on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And I want particularly to discuss the way that Ward's novel departs from and throws into relief certain tendencies of speculative fiction, which is an increasingly dominant mode for writing about the environment. And I should say I fully agree with Anne that speculative fiction and the possibilities of it as a critical genre and in a complex dialectic with realist modes. Nevertheless, kind of teaching Ward in a constellation of science fiction texts kind of brings up some interesting assumptions of the genre. I suggest that for Ward, the environmental disasters that appear to other authors a calamitous break from the past highlight instead certain ongoing social crises, and they also, ironically, open the possibility for new future directions forward. Before turning to Ward, just one quick, or a couple quick points about speculative fiction. So the literary scholar Frederick Buell offers a persuasive hypothesis why contemporary writers are frequently drawn to speculative techniques. In Buell's account, speculative fiction is a necessary mode for a world characterized by the existential instability and uncertainty of the present moment. He writes, contemporary global warming narratives dramatize the lost foundations, terrible instabilities, and already entailed futures of an anthropocenic present. Now, contemporary speculative fiction takes a variety of forms, the most popular being post-apocalyptic narratives. And these have claimed a great deal of the cultural map, from you can think of video games and television and film to literature and even popular science writing. We read the kind of wonderful book, The World Without Us by Alan Weisman, which is popular science, but in a dystopian mode. My students read also Margaret Atwood and Paolo Bacigalupi, examples of dystopian science fiction, which envision a devastated planet after climate collapse and imagine how the social and political order might be transformed in the face of ecological upheaval. But not all speculative fiction looks like science fiction, and Pace Gauche's argument in The Great Derangement, for Buell, the speculative is colonizing mainstream literature as our world becomes increasingly transformed. For example, Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior, which my class also reads, is an unusual example of speculative fiction. Using Sylvia Meyer's typology of different kinds of risk narratives, it focuses not on the future when a risk scenario is materialized in a catastrophe, but on the present moment, which is characterized by a strong sense of uncertainty and controversy about how to respond to various threats. Yet Kingsolver's novel dramatically changes one aspect of current reality. It imagines the massive roost sites of monarch butterflies in Mexico shifting to rural Appalachia and records how their appearance changes the life of a small town community forced to reckon with a transformed climate. In this way, Kingsolver intertwines fantasy and the quotidian world we know, imagining an alternate present which condenses and amplifies the slowly unfolding processes of climate change. So my students encounter Ward in this section of a course on climate change fiction, after reading Kingsolver, but before Atwood and Bacigalupi, and alongside two other works by African-American artists about Katrina, section of Claudia Rakin's 2014 poem Citizen, and Spike Lee's 2006 documentary When the Levee Broke. And Ward is very different from those two works in terms of the hurricane's aftermath. I mean, it's really a strange, kind of quiet but polemical gesture. FEMA and the repressive state are simply kind of absent from the novel. In some ways, it's more interested in kind of formations like Common Ground that Jacob talked about, and kind of mutual community support. Salvage the Bones, which won the 2011 National Book Award, harkens back to the towering precedent of Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, another Gulf Coast hurricane narrative. Ward's novel appeared 6 years after Hurricane Katrina, which Ward experienced directly in her hometown of Delisle, Mississippi, when her family was forced from their home by rising waters and sheltered in a car in a field. Actually, they were denied entry into a white neighbor's home, and so had to kind of spend this harrowing night in a field. But in certain respects, Salvage the Bones is a disaster novel not about disaster. Although it climaxes with the hurricane, during the first 3/4 of the story, you catch the approach of the storm only out of the corner of the eye of the teenage narrator, Esh Batiste. A potential disaster remains in the narrator's peripheral vision as she deals with more quotidian concerns: the dynamics of family life with 3 brothers and an alcoholic father, her closest brother Skeeta's effort to raise pit bulls for fighting, and especially her recent pregnancy and abandonment by her lover. Concerns with modes of survival in everyday life, the novel tracks the family's effort at subsistence and care, which depend upon various acts of salvage, hence the novel's title. The Batiste home is made from salvage materials from other abandoned houses. They hunt for food in the woods, and they even salvage words. She recollects how her deceased mother mashes expressions together. So practices of salvage would seem at home in Atwood's and Bacigalupi's post-apocalyptic landscapes, but they read differently in Ward in a couple of ways. First, they're kind of entwined with a critique of possessive individualism as the basis of subjectivity. But secondly, in Ward, the attempts the characters to make to patch their lives together are shadowed by the irony that all their efforts might be swept away in the flood. In this way, the novel asks what it means to live under a lowering calamity at the same time as exploring a condition Lauren Berlant has usefully named crisis ordinariness. Berlant argues that the social problems such as obesity and drug addiction, which are frequently described as epidemics, should be characterized instead as endemics because they transpire not as sudden events but within a zone of temporality marked by ongoingness, getting by and living on, where structural inequalities are dispersed and the pacing of experience uneven. This concept is useful for the novel because Ward overlays ordinary crisis with the approaching disaster in a number of ways. One is in the metaphoric register. She turns to the language of storm to characterize daily life. Things like a neighbor's dog who chases the teenagers is described as the color of a storm wrapped in rain. Besides balancing crisis ordinariness with ecological catastrophe, Ward's temporal arrangement also departs from speculative fiction. Katrina was often taken as an index of an anticipated future, rendered in the popular media as a portent from a future of runaway warning, as in Al Gore's 2006 film Inconvenient Truth, or in contemporary fiction like Bacigalupi's Shipbreaker, or Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140, with boats drawn Katrina imagery to evoke a dystopian future. But Ward's arrangement of time differs much from these examples. The textures of Esh's mental life overlays past and present, weaving a dense series of flashbacks into the account of unfolding events. Even Hurricane Katrina is experienced through memories of previous storms. In the first pages, the narrator remarks, "It's summer, and when it's summer, there's always a hurricane coming or leaving." So Katrina is less a marker of a brave new world and more the realization of what is always an imminent possibility. For Ward's characters, who inhabit a world where there's always a hurricane coming and going, Buell's description of climate change narratives representing the lost foundations, terrible instabilities, and already entailed futures of an anthropocenic present is somewhat off. For Ward tracks histories of African American life, of segregation, inequality, and environmental racism that present lost foundations and terrible instabilities rooted in times long before the contemporary climate crisis. Ironically, though, Ward's story is perhaps the most optimistic on my syllabus. For the world the hurricane threatens is one of hierarchy and exclusion. Indeed, her work suggests that the crisis posed by climate change might bring to a head violence that is already implicit and present in the social order, and thus might provide the possibility of a transformed future. Surveying the damage of a neighboring town, the narrator remarks, "The gas station, the yacht club, and all the old white column homes that face the beach that made us feel small and dirty and poorer than ever when we came here with Daddy, piled in his truck for gas or chips or bait on our swimming days, are gone. Not ravaged, not rubble, but completely gone."
Okay, our final speaker this session will be Professor Yuna Chowdhury from the Department of English. Dear Climate After Harvey.
And I do have slides. Actually, I have a lot of slides. I have to apologize to my colleagues on the panel. There's going to be a lot of swiveling involved for you.
We're tough.
Okay. Okay, well.
Set up a mirror or something.
Okay. Well, I also would like to thank Bella, Anne, and Peder for organizing this terrific event and fostering this really important, rich conversation for us here at NYU. I'm very happy to be here. So, a play that I helped to make and stage a few years ago. It's not quite working. Okay. Featured a New York curator who wants to make meaningful art about climate change, which to her, in a kind of sad failure of imagination, means collaborating with artists in Bangladesh to tell the stories of quote-unquote real climate refugees. Like a woman she's read about in the New York Times whose shack was demolished by a mud flood. And there's a photograph of that woman back there. Meanwhile, this curator is sure there's something wrong with the insulation in her New York apartment. And she keeps calling her super, asking him to check the walls. At the end of the play, she discovers the truth when she opens the door of her closet and outpours a flood of mud, garbage, mosquitoes, and crocodiles. Bangladesh and climate change has been right there all along in her apartment, and it's finally come out of the closet. That's how the play ends. Well, Scott Pruitt and his boss are bent on putting climate change back in the closet. Specifically, Trump has declared war on science. Sorry, that's the end of the play. Trump has declared war on science, as was frighteningly documented in this editorial last week. What does that mean for someone like me, who's always maintained that art and the imagination have a different task and a different role, an important role, vis-a-vis climate change and ecological crisis than science? That question became even more pointed last week when Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, which happened also to be where we recently presented a show from a collaborative project that I have worked on for the past 5 years. From the start, Dear Climate has sought to intervene in the contemporary climate imaginary in a very specific way, to nudge it away from catastrophism and survivalism and towards experimentation, improvisation, and transformation. Dear Climate asks how the prevailing affect around climate change, which seems to be dominated by fear and guilt, can be expanded to foster a more creative and more resilient relationship, emotional and conceptual relationship, to climate realities. We sought this shift on behalf of a speculative future, a climate changed but non-dystopian, disanthropocentric future of multi-species thriving. We hope that a kind of playful what-if mode would open up some unexpected spaces for creative engagement with otherwise frightening things. The playful tone was also a strategy to avoid the temptation to offer solutions and answers that we don't really have, and instead to get as deeply, even absurdly, into a mode of questioning as we could go. We structured our thinking around 3 movements of mind, imagined as a process of discovering a new emotional and conceptual relationship to the scary phenomena of climate change. And the 3 movements were meet climate change, befriend climate change, become climate change. What if instead of cowering before these scary things, we warmly greeted them? What if we saluted the superstorms, said hello to the hurricanes, played knock-knock games with the climate? What if we widened our circles of sociality and culture to welcome in the non-human, watching pigeon pantomimes, following squirrel soap operas? We also tried to try out other affective registers not usually associated with ecology, much less with climate chaos: permissiveness, flirtation, sulking, being narcissistic. Dear Climate was designed to respond to different opportunities for presentation and different modes of reception, including performances, workshops, and installations. Here are some examples of work we've done. This was in Dublin. This was in the Netherlands. Very different forms. This was as part of the recent climate change conference here at NYU, for which we created this poster. And then last spring, we were featured in Houston at the Center for Energy and Environmental Research. For this presentation, our presentation took the form of a sort of faux FEMA help station, offering help for your inner climate. And I'm just going to run through a few images. This was opening night. This was some of what happened. This is coming inside and getting sort of strange brochures and strange materials that you might take with you. There was also a form that people had to fill out, which asked them, surprising questions. Where is your current shelter? What other species do you share it with? Those kinds of things. We also had our podcasts, which are part of the Dear Climate Project, were disguised as help stations. Here people could pick this up, and what they would hear are kind of faux meditations on multi-species climate experience. So this is, and I'm just going to let these slides go by as I conclude here to say that for me, the question after Harvey, last couple of weeks, was that how might we continue in the face of increasingly massive suffering, like the one happening now, to cultivate affects other than the prevailing fear, anger, blame, sorrow? What kinds of contextualization, if any, might our work need or benefit from to continue to do the work we started out to do with this project, which was to shift the climate imaginary in such a way as to include intimacy, embodiedness, and an alternative non-dystopian climate change future of multi-species thriving? How can we position, I'm asking myself, I'm asking you, how might we position a project like Dear Climate so that the affects that it favors, like surprise, delight, friendliness, wackiness, aren't hurtful or even obnoxious? I guess I'm asking how to keep Dear Climate's search for alternative imaginations from being overwhelmed by the current realities. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you to all of the speakers. We have some time for questions. I believe someone will be bringing a microphone around. Okay. Does anyone have a question they would like to start with? Or end with, I suppose. That's right. No one yet? Yes.
How much money would it take to fix everything?
I don't know, does anyone have a financial estimate at hand?
How much you lost?
What do you mean by everything?
Pollution, all activity that's hurtful to the
depends on how you count. So it depends on how you value, and this is something that in the field of economics is being taken more and more seriously. It's how you assign value to the environment and to things in the environment. And if you assign those things value, then in the long term it actually turns out it doesn't cost very much if the forest has a value besides, as it's traditionally calculated, in board feet of lumber. Then actually the answer is it doesn't actually cost that much. If instead you think that leaving the trees standing is sacrificing the value of the board feet of lumber and not substituting it with something else, then it's unreasonably expensive. I think that's the kind of both a little bit glib and a little bit serious answer to the question. But an actual figure in trillions of dollars, I don't know. Yeah, I know. I was trying to give a serious answer, but
Also in front.
To your question, I think if the climate change can be solved by just with money, then it's not a difficult problem. It is that our perceptions towards the relationship of human beings and nature and all of that philosophy that's embedded in us and our society nowadays that's making it so complicated. That's my thought.
My question was, yesterday our speaker kind of talked about how if she were giving a lecture in another part of this country that maybe wasn't so adamant on climate change being a thing, she would present things differently, and I think that's also where art can come into play and be very important and very different, and when people are kind of not accepting facts, which I guess is done now, art can do something, and I was wondering if Dear Climate Project has been taken into places that are maybe where communities are less either sensitive to climate change or like not like rejecting it totally, or if any of you have spoken about these things with people who don't acknowledge it as a problem.
Not really. I mean, it's essentially it's an art project,
Mm-hmm.
and most of the presentations and installations have tended to be in art contexts, including the workshops and so on, or educational contexts. They're intended to foster a conversation, including invite in perspectives that don't agree with us. And so sometimes that happens in the course of the sort of surrounding discourse that emerges from them. The nature of the imagery is intended to be kind of open enough and counterintuitive enough to be engaging for a variety of different directions, and that does seem to happen. One of the things we've done at the workshops is letter writing sessions where we just invite people to write letters to the climate from their own perspective, but also mainly from the perspective of other non-human entities, including elements of consumer culture that they love very much, and really kind of take stock and create an understanding of how much we invested in the infrastructure of consumerism that is tied to these larger realities that were associated with climate change. And in the course of that, you do get people beginning to be very honest and very challenging about their own limitations in dealing with this subject matter. So it fosters a lot of different kinds of conversations, I'd say. Yeah.
Louise? Up in the middle.
Thank you. I think the combination of points of view and speakers was just terrific. I come a little bit of the first question, and also following from Naomi Oreskes last night, that we talked about, say, a fix. Like, okay, we start to understand maybe the magnitude of the problem and hear 6 different narratives that she talked about last night about the failure of the different narratives. One thing we talked about last night was the carbon tax, and what is the price to fix this? So I wonder, again, in your review of, say, science or science fiction literature or the arts literature, do you feel that we bridge that gap with the economists or the scientists, or do you feel like C.P. Snow said, 5 decades ago, we still have 2 cultures, that the arts and humanities people and the science empiricists don't speak the same language? That's my fear. That's my fear, why Naomi Oreskes could so easily discard the carbon tax, which is a regulatory environment. We are regulated to the hilt. People somehow don't like it, but we have things like speed limits. We have seat belts. We have that, right? We accept that. So I guess my question is the idea of another regulatory framework that's an economic model, is it so alien to us, or does that show up in science fiction? I mean, I'm just curious, in the literature and arts, do we bridge that economists, hard science, people that deal with numbers gap?
I can channel a good friend of mine who's an oceanographer who works on the solubility of gases in salt water, so essentially the kind of carbon uptake into the ocean problem. And he's a huge fan of Bacigalupi, not Shipbreaker, but Waterknife, which he says is not science fiction, but it is a best case scenario for where we're going. And this is, so he goes on what he calls WASF tours to debate deniers. You can figure it out, I'm not gonna say it. And he's at the far end of the pessimistic spectrum about these things. He says it's too late, it's already over, it's game over. And it's just a question of how bad things are gonna get. With that, he says, in a sense, and that is the vision of the Waterknife, in which the United States is disaggregated, and it's about the dissolution of the Colorado River Compact, in which the states are trying to snap up as many of the riparian rights treaties from the original moment of colonization as they can, so that they can monopolize the water, what water's left in the Colorado. And it ends with California sending its National Guard to blow up the Glen Canyon Dam in Utah. It's a great, great novel. So this person, I'm not going to out him, but he speaks our language. He reads these things. He says that we're not being pessimistic enough, and which might be a sad commentary on it. And in a sense, he says carbon taxes are beside the point at this point. And so the question is, how are we going to live in a world that is going to change, and there is nothing that we can do to stop it? We can only now address realistically an environment that's going to be so radically changed in the next 200 years as to be unrecognizable. And hey, he knows a lot more about this than I do, so I will, I'll defer to him on that.
Yeah, I think a lot of really interesting fiction does kind of engage this, and often it is speculative. So Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140 was just out in the last 6 months. It's really kind of a wonderful multi-plot novel, but it has a derivatives trader and kind of long, just long passages kind of thinking about the derivatives market or about the underlying ecology of the New York City islands. And just the kind of the phantasms of the market. I mean, what derivative trading is so speculative. And literature's kind of ability to grapple with questions of scale and causality, I think are very kind of useful frameworks for thinking about questions of the climate. On the other hand, the kind of question of how much money will it take, I think is difficult to answer, partly because the framework it closes down kind of certain possibilities of transformation. And as the kind of in the first panel, Jerome Whittington was talking about how the environmental movement has really given over to the logic of the market in many ways, in things like carbon pricing, which was a disaster and manipulated. And there are kind of a whole range of regulatory models, some of them giving over to market logic kind of less. And a real fundamental question is whether market logic is going to get us out of this mess. And I certainly don't think it is.
Just a moment.
I just wanted to add one thing that another area in which the two cultures gap is being closed and bridged, that's very important and exciting to me, is in all these discourses that are really emerging and growing in the humanities that come under the umbrella of it's sometimes called the non-human turn, or it's sometimes called the new materialism, It takes, for example, the form of efforts to renaturalize feminism. Someone like Stacey Alaimo, about early natures, about transcorporeality, is offered as a kind of corrective to the purely social constructivist thinking. And so there's a lot of there's a range of directions from which humanists and social scientists are paying attention to the areas previously sequestered or dominated by the sciences. So I feel that dialogue is really burgeoning. There's a society called Society for Literature and the Arts, SLSA, which meets every year and has just fabulous conferences. Now, from my experience, it's kind of one-sided. It has been the arts and the humanities really reaching out and taking a very serious and lively interest in the debates and developments in the sciences. But there are, of course, as Carl just said, scientists who are availing themselves of literary materials in order to convey their findings. And I think underneath it all, there's this feeling of urgency that all of us are experiencing, and a sense that we've just got to diversify our toolkits and get, start as many conversations as possible, and not be as nervous about disciplinary silos as we've been trained to be in the academy, to just be more, experimental and courageous about stepping out of our comfort zones and talking to each other across these boundaries.
Could I just very quickly, I mean, the whole point of my little presentation was, though, that sometimes it's easy for us to point at the scientists and say they're in their bubble. But I think we have to be really careful, because things like Parker's book, they misappropriate what science is actually telling us about the climate record. And then they deploy it in a way that's so easily falsifiable that it makes us look like idiots, and then, in a sense, undermines any credibility we have as a voice in these kinds of debates. So, I think as humanists, we have this tendency, so, Matt and I are historians of science, so we're kind of used to dealing with this, but as humanists, we have this tendency to say, well, those scientists don't listen to us enough. But, in a sense, we not only don't listen to them enough, but we don't take the time to figure out what it is they're actually saying. And that is as big a problem as their failure to engage with the humanities.
Another question near the back there.
When looking at climate change through a historical lens, where it's a process and not a singular event, is there an argument at how far back in the past do we go?
I can give an easy answer to that. Historians deal with ultimately with kind of human action and human events and human agency. The further back you go, the more speculative you have to be, and it all depends on what kind of other documentation or what kind of archival record you have to correlate with the findings of historical climatology. So, you know, once you go back further than the Neolithic Revolution, then you're in the realm of kind of pure speculation. The closer you get to the present, the more information you have to correlate. So, for example, for 19th century United States history, Thoreau, aside from writing Walden, actually kept this elaborate and incredibly boring diary of the weather. And what day every year the lupine bloomed, and so some people have tried to sort of work that into a kind of argument about people noticing, as some of my fellow panelists say, changes. The book that I used as a kind of example of good work in the field, Ling Zhang's book, China, in the China field, we can go a lot further back, because the Chinese state exists more or less in a kind of continuous way despite dynastic changes for much longer than other states. And local officials were charged with keeping what were called gazettes. And so we have the Chinese gazetteers, and one of the things they're supposed to record are things like first snowfall and so on. It was just their job. And so we actually have data, and that's been used by historians in the China field in incredibly interesting ways. So there's a great book by the historian Robert Marks called Tigers, Rice, Silk, and Silt about environmental changes in South China, and he uses tiger attacks as an index of deforestation. So more deforestation, more tiger attacks on livestock and humans because they have less forest land to roam in. So the answer is it depends, and I think we're getting better and better. Environmental historians are getting better and better at and more skilled at doing it, with some exceptions.
I just want to say very quickly, I mean, that both are historians. We in the literary arts look at literature as a kind of a record, at least a poetic record. And I think that even in my studies when looking at Shakespeare, for example, and also what Sarah was doing, is that we see embedded in the literature of the day, we see these kinds of, not only do we see records, but we see real attitudes about people's relationship to not only the climate, but to nature, to animals, to everything. And I think they're very revelatory. That's how I felt about Shakespeare. It's really telling us that when nature really acts out, it's like a no-brainer. You have to really figure out what's going on, and then we can use that if we have access to it, the kind of thing that Carl is talking about. Do we have actual data to correlate that? But clearly things were going on in Shakespeare's time as we know in Dickens' time, and people, that's where I think literature and the arts can come in. Did you want to?
I just want to add one thing. Besides this question of how far back you go, it's also where you look for some of these continuities and understand the process. And the book that Anne mentioned, Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement, it offers a really accessible, eloquent, and enlightening account of the role played by imperialism, by colonialism in the current climate crisis. And he's the first person to have written that up in a very accessible way. This was the Berlin Family Lectures that he gave a couple of years ago, which is now published as a book. And it really expands one's understanding of the sources and the international global roots of the current climate crisis.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Maleko, you want to bring us home?
Just a kind of a quick question, because the humanities and the arts touch on particular literacies and so forth. And my question was, has anyone in the panel thought about the ideas or ramifications of ideas of class structures and class interests? Because it takes a particular kind of aesthetic education to be able to start to read these things, understand it, absorb it, whether it's from Dickens, obviously he writes about class, or even just being able to experience an art object and read an art object and be able to find out what this thing means to me, even though I might not be an art historian, and know, all the stuff it's supposed to mean. I don't know if there's any interest or ideas about the role of class and class interests, or even class structures within these politics, because we talked about culture and race and gender and so forth, but not so much about class.
Yeah.
It's on already.
It's on, okay. I'll just, thank you. I think, there's a lot of ways, it's such a huge, broad, I think what you're raising is really, it's important, obviously, but when it's a very huge, broad, capacious, that is, for instance, I could think about, there are different ways if you're thinking about modes of consumption of different kinds of artwork and accessibility. We can think also that, this isn't a thoroughgoing answer to your question at all, but it's just kind of one road that one could take is that somebody like Dickens and also lots of other writers of the period who were contemporary to him were actually very popular writers. They are not writing high culture, occult narratives that one needs a great deal of preparation or education to access. Not to say that, they're entirely accessible to everybody, but Dickens sees himself as very much a popular writer. And he is making a great effort in the modes through which his work circulates, making a great effort for it to be accessible in terms of economic, in terms of cost, right? So he publishes both part publications, so you can actually buy a couple of chapters for a very low rate, for a very low price or comparatively low price. These are unstable categories, right? But also is publishing serially. So, there's that. But I think that the question you're asking is actually much larger than that, and it goes in a bunch of other directions in terms of, some of these, and maybe it goes to, in part also some of the things in a way that Louise and a couple other people were asking about impacts, right? And about the ways in which these things are, like, who's speaking to whom about whom, right? And I think those are larger questions that we can think about.
I just wanted to say, Una's installation, which brought to mind something that's happening a lot now in the environmental history literature, is stress the fact that climate change is an embodied experience, but it's embodied in a different way depending upon where you are in social hierarchies or class, which I think is the thrust of your question. And so a book like Greg Mittman's Breathing Space, which looks at the way in which allergies are a product of human action, like we've created the allergies environments that make asthma more common now. But asthma as an embodied experience is really different if you are living in a housing project in the South Bronx versus if you are an asthmatic kid in a middle-class suburb of Philadelphia, which actually is one of the examples he starts with. He actually starts with Mr. T, but there's a famous thing of him cutting down all the trees of his house in Lake Forest and people getting upset, but he had allergies. So I think that, not just writing that, but then getting people to come in and convey how their embodied experience is different. That's the key, and I thought that's what I really liked about your installation is it did that.
Yeah. Anne, last thoughts?
There's a lot I could say about your question, in response to your question, Maleko, but I'll just to say a little bit more about Butler's novel, Parable of the Sower. She is quite interested in the ways that class intersects with the kinds of environmental degradation in California, and also how those things intersect with racial categories and with gender and with disability. So that is certainly an issue that is on her mind as a writer, and in different ways. weighs also on them, it's fine. But
All right, we are out of time. Can we thank the panel once more for a fascinating discussion? We're going to take a break for lunch now, and we'll reconvene at 2 o'clock. I look forward to seeing you all again.